Hajara, my student, and Jack Burnett is another student. It's a bit mouthful to look at the title, so let me just go straightly into the content of the talk. Okay, so the idea is, how do you transfer healthcare data securely? If you want to be a short title, that would be the shortest thing I can think of. But let's look at the motivation of the study first. Okay. So the work has been undertaken as part of a larger project, and the larger idea of how healthcare analytics is this. We want to link patient data from clinics, hospital, communities, and administrative. Okay, link them together. That's the ethos of big data, basically. So so that you have build a bigger picture of what a patient may look like through different sources of information. And after that, you want to put the data into analytics, and the objective of which is to understand the trend, to evaluate performance, and to make informed decisions. And the output, what are the benefits? So these are some of the benefits: is to optimize revenue for care professionals, to enhance clinical effectiveness, to stay competitive, to improve staffing, to optimize service levels, and so on. Okay, so the benefits can be, these benefits are claimed by the IBM's white paper below. But you can see lots of other sources of why healthcare big data are beneficial. Okay. Now, back to the context of this particular study, we assume that we have not one client, but many clients. So these are like clinics, hospitals, and so on, where we put the data onto the server, and there's analytics, and then we have a graphical user interface that interfaces with a thin client, where data analytics is delivered. Okay. So there are several issues with that. We can look at the components of the architecture, how to aggregate the data in a securely through the usual extract, transform, load operation. How do you secure the data? How do you transmit the data securely? How do you represent the data in a flexible manner? How do you store the data securely on the server? How do you build personalized model? How do you design a usable front end? And of course, how to visualize the data, present it to the end users. So that completes, more or less a complete picture of the architecture of the system. In this particular talk, we look at the data transmission only, specifically looking at data transmission using cryptographic techniques. The three other topics has been discussed in my other paper, Challenges in Designing an Online Healthcare Analytic Platform. So this was a talk given on the first day of the conference. Okay. Now, what are the problems we're trying to solve in this particular study context here? The context here in data transmission. Okay. So the motivation is this. Today, not all algorithms can be distributed. Some of the algorithms can certainly be distributed, but not all of them. Even if you can distribute them, there might be network latency. This is certainly work in progress. Much work has to be done. But on the other hand, distributed records are not viable. Okay, there might be risk issues. So if you upload data on a cloud, care professionals may not be very happy. They will think about what happens if the data are breached, data are leaked, who will be held responsible, and there are so many issues to deal with. So the solutions we have is this. We know that we have to work with practical constraints. So rather than looking at algorithmic solutions, let's step backwards and say, let's find a simpler solution using cryptography. And the idea is this: step one, let's opt to use a cloud computing server and assume that it is secure to store the data in the cloud. So the question comes in: how do we combine? How do we extract the data, put it on the cloud? But before that, how to run the identify algorithm, and how do we encrypt the data securely? So that, because the data is going to leave one site to the cloud server, which is secure, but how about the transmission process? So specifically, we look at this. Because if we solve this problem and the data is stored in a centralized repository in a certain way, in a de-identified manner, satisfies some of the care professionals' requirements, then perhaps you can run your machine learning algorithm, your old faithful machine learning algorithms on the repository. So that's the concept. So we not deal with the analytics itself. That's going to be a problem on its own. So we just look at step 1 and 2. Okay. Now let's look at, so with that understanding, we look at the cryptographic constructs. What are tools available out there? Myself, my background is computer science, more on machine learning, but we still look at what's the tools available. Okay, so for this, we look at what are the operations that we need that needs to be performed on the clinical records. So the first operation is what we call data anonymization. And as it said here, it is a process that seeks to hide the identity of sensitive records by removing patient's identifiers. So the patient identifiers are like the name, date of birth, postcodes, age, and so on. Okay? And pseudonymization, that's a process that's defined as the use of false data known as pseudonyms to replace the personally identifier information. So rather than using your hospital ID, unique ID, it is replaced by another meaningless number. Okay, re-identify is to recover the patient ID from a pseudonym. So let's look at it graphically. So in the first process, in the data anonymization, PII is patient identifiable information. So you remove the PII, and whereas for the medical records, we're going to transform it somehow so that it become conform to whatever regulations required, and so that requires manipulation of the medical records. Note that I divide the data into 2 parts, the PII parts and the medical records. Okay, so if you separate the two, then essentially you don't know who these people are. Okay, so the idea is in the anonymization is to process the 2 parts somehow. In particular, after the transformation, there's no PII there. Okay, whereas pseudonymization doesn't touch the medical records, it just processes the PII. In particular, the PII value is hashed to another meaningless value using a cryptographic operation called hashing. Okay, re-identification, on the other hand, is trying to infer from the hash value the unique patient ID. This is the unique patient ID that was in the PII. So it's reversing the process. Okay. Now we look at the cryptography literature for the purpose of our discussion. In a very simplistic view, is that there are 2 parts. The first part is called hashing. The second part is called encryption. Under encryption, you have symmetric and asymmetric encryption. And further down the symmetric encryption, you have block cipher and stream cipher. We're not going to go into very details, just for the purpose of what we need in this discussion. We will look at the hashing. It's a one-way hashing, and that's used for pseudonymization. That's one of the operations that's required. The second part is the hybrid encryption, which makes use of symmetric and asymmetric encryption. We're going to talk about that later on, both of them. Okay? So now let's come back to the hashing part. Okay? One of the cryptographic operation constructs that we will be using. So in terms of functionality, it looks like that. You take the unique patient ID, apply a hashing algorithm, and this has the property that the mapping is non-reversible. It goes one way, but you can't go back. Okay? And what you get is a unique hash value. So that's called pseudonymization. Now the reverse is called re-identification. But if you cannot go back, how do you do the re-identification? Yeah, that's the question. And why we need re-identification? It is because if we find something wrong with that particular patient, we want to go back to the clinicians and say that, hey, we found from the data that this particular patient needs to be examined more closely. So we need to go back to the clinician and say, can you look at this patient and do something about it? Okay? So that's re-identification. But if this is a one-way transform, how do you go back? And the idea is this. We're going to build a table with a unique patient ID and a unique hash value as a couple, and store them in a lookup table somewhere. So when we have the lookup table, it's easy to map it back. So that lookup table has to be stored securely in the care professional's computer, for example. But they will never need to go out of the hospital. Okay, so that solved the re-identification problem. But there's another problem. That is, if you systematically hash the unique patient ID, and in some cases, you can actually you can infer what this value is by looking at the characteristics, by looking at the distribution and things like that. And to guard against this attack, we add a salt, which is another random number, basically, and add it to and give it to the hashing algorithm to do a hash unique. So every time you hash a different value. So that's basic principle. So that's a kind of a solution that is used often in the cryptographic community. Okay, so we'll look at hashing, but what's the recommendation? So as a small recommendation, we can say that the hashing is got to be deterministic and repeatable, and collisions shouldn't happen. That's what they call collision resistant. If you hash one value to another value, what you don't want is two patient ID hashed to the same pseudonym. So that should be avoided. That's why the hashing should be collision resistant. And it should be reversible. So that's the property of hashing, and that's provided by the cryptography construct in hashing. For the salt, there is a recommendation. So we look at the literature. The advice is that the adequate size should be more than 128 bits. And the salt must have adequate length. It must contain a possible set of value large enough and difficult enough to be guessed. Okay, so these are just, some of the recommendations. Now let's look at encryption. Now encryption, the first I will talk about symmetric encryption. So the title isn't correct. So the idea is you have a client that sends the client side, and there's a server side. Okay, at the client side, let's say we transfer some data, patient records, and we're going to encrypt it with a shared symmetric key. The key between the client and the server are the same. That's why we call this a shared symmetric key. And hence the encryption is called symmetric encryption. Okay, because they use the same key to lock and to unlock the message. What is being passed over is a ciphertext. Again, another jargon used in cryptography. In asymmetric encryption, it's nearly the same as a symmetric one, except that the keys used are different. So the first key to do the encryption is a server's public key, and the one to do the decrypt is a server's private key. Okay, you need a pair of keys, but otherwise they look quite similar. But neither of the encryption, symmetric or asymmetric, satisfies our requirement. What is needed is a combination of both, actually. We called it a hybrid encryption. Again, we didn't propose this. It's all in the literature. So we just need to use it for the purpose of transmitting patient data. And how does it work? So now I color code those keys. So on the left-hand side, you have the symmetric encryption. I use a gray key. On the right-hand side, we have an orange and a red key. Okay, so one is for encrypt public. So the yellow is the server's public key, and the rosy one is the server's private key. Okay, so I have three keys. I have three keys in the hybrid encryption, and the way it works is this. First, we're going to use the asymmetric encryption, but rather than encrypting the patient record, we're going to encrypt the key, the shared key. Okay, so that's the first difference. But otherwise, it's just a usual asymmetric encryption. And the purpose of this is to generate an asymmetric key to be shared by both parties. After we have done that, we go to the symmetric encryption solution. Exactly the same. We're going to, so the second step is exactly the same as a symmetric encryption. We take the patient record, because now the two parties have the same shared key, symmetric key they can use to encrypt and decrypt. And the reason we do this is because symmetric encryption is much faster than asymmetric encryption. So if you have a large quantity of patient data, you're better off doing asymmetric encryption. It speeds up the encryption and the decryption process. If you use the asymmetric encryption to do the same, it's going to take a long time. Okay, so the idea is to transfer the symmetric keys shared by both parties, and after that, use a symmetric key to transfer the patient records in 2 steps. And with that, we kind of solved the problem. But if you're actually trying to do it in practice, there are actually a number of questions regarding the key management, okay? So then we come to the key management issues. Again, we didn't find much literature that talks about how do we actually transfer the patient records in encryption, using encryption methods. These are all existing, technologies. This has been existing for a long time, but there seems to be a vacuum in the literature on how we should actually use the key. So we look at the key management issues, and there are 4 of them. First is, so look at the picture above there. There's a client and server, just to make sure that we know what to talk about. So we are talking about the symmetric key. Where should the key be generated? We can generate the key at the client side, but also at the server side. And of course, because we found that at the client side, there isn't much libraries that allows us to do the encryption, to generate the key. It might be safer to do it at the server side. So that's the first recommendation. How often should the key be generated? Should it be generated every day, every session, or every minute? And our recommendation is that well, you maybe want to generate a key once a day, and during that day you can transfer as much data as you want, and after that you revoke the key, just throw it away. But if you want to be safer, you can do it for every session. So every session you generate a shared symmetric key, and so if there's an attacker that was able to crack the key, but the next session he won't be able to do it. You can also do it every hour if you want. Okay, but the idea is to do it as regular as you can, so to make sure that the transmission channel is secure, and during that period, an attacker cannot actually attempt to decrypt the data. Okay, and cryptographic constructs give us the guarantee that to get the plain text out of the ciphertext, it's going to take a long time. That's a guarantee provided by cryptographic constructs. Okay. And how long should the key length be? Again, we look at the literature. Basically, it should be it's a trade-off between security and decryption time. And RSA 256, again, a particular choice of algorithm, suggests that that's the kind of things that you can use. Okay, and that's remains secure until 2013. So we can probably use it at the meantime. How should the symmetric key be generated and stored? And the idea is that we don't store the key at the client side. If you want to store it, please store it at the server side. And you can always share the key and if you need it. Okay? So that's the recommendation. Now, having done that, if you look at the cryptographic literature, then you always want to look at the vulnerability of the system. So we propose a solution. Then you want to come back and check out, oh, okay, we propose some solutions, but is it secure? Is it robust to attacks? So we have to engage in a vulnerability assessment. So that's exactly what we have done. We said, oh, patient ID is compromised. But how is it compromised? When is it compromised? And here the attacks can be done when the data is in transit, that's in the transmission channel. There can be eavesdropping, people trying to sniff the packets and then try to get information. But there might be attacks done at the clinical medical records itself, the database itself. Okay, they could impose a physical threat, create fire. If they know where the server is, they can burn the facilities. They can create a power surge, cut off the power, and so these are the very tangible, very real attacks happening to the database. Okay. But they also attacks at the patient's hash value. So let's say they get out of the data. Now they get a hash value. They're going to try to find out who the patient ID is. So this is but if you use pseudonym, then you're probably okay. Okay. So then there are different attacks. We just highlight that we have done that exercise, but rather than going into the details. So let's just summarize what our findings so far. So our finding here is that, so that's the architecture we are looking to solve. We have looked at the data transmission aspects. We have addressed the key management issues, and there are 4 of them. And we have engaged in a fishbone analysis. So that kind of diagram is called fishbone. We look at the attack on the hash value, on the database, and the data in transit. So thank you very much.